Hello, everybody. Thanks for joining today. Welcome to the MSP Threat Briefing by ConnectWise. My name is Rafael Marti. I'm the General Manager for Cybersecurity, and I'm joined by two of my favorite colleagues here, Drew and Bryson. Drew, why don't you say hi quickly?
Sure. Hello, everybody. Drew Sanford, VP of Security Operations here at ConnectWise. I get the joy of being able to manage and run a lot of our services teams that deliver on a lot of our security products. So it's really good to be with you today and talk about this. Bryson?
Yeah, I'm Bryson Medlock. I work in the Cyber Research Unit, or the Security Research and Threat Intelligence team here at ConnectWise. And I wear a lot of different hats, do a lot of back-end stuff, as well as, coming to you guys and talk about all the great threat intel stuff that we do.
Awesome. Thanks for joining me today. We have a pretty interesting couple of topics that we're going to discuss. We're going to first launch into a little bit of an overview of what's going on in the MSP threat landscape. Then we'll talk a little bit about our MSP yearly threat report that just came out, and we're actually going to discuss that in a different webinar as well, but more on that in a second. And then we're also going to talk about the XZ attack that probably a lot of you have seen. I thought it was a fascinating story behind how they infiltrated the repos, and we'll get into the details of that. It's just a very interesting learning experience, I think, for all of us on seeing what the bad guys are doing and how creative they're getting. Yeah. With that, Bryson, why don't you take us a little bit into the threat landscape, what's happening, what has changed in the last couple of months since we talked last?
Sure. Just to start off with, looking at the actual malware that we've been seeing, the main one I just kind of wanted to highlight here, our top malware that we've seen over the past quarter is fake updates, also known as sock ghoulish. So it is a malware loader or dropper. The color coding you see here, I've kind of highlighted or color coded different types of malware. So a loader is something that's just used for initial access, and then it just installs itself, and then it downloads other malware. So usually it'll install something, it might install an info stealer, or it might install a backdoor, which is then used to gather additional information, maybe eventually lead to ransomware, but the loader is kind of the first thing. This fake updates, it's one that specifically, it's JavaScript that uses a compromised websites to look or disguise itself as updates to software that you need on your system. So you need, Windows updates, or there's a vulnerability in some software that you've got, and so you need to download an update for it. That's what it's doing. We see this a lot. It's a JavaScript loader. So it all runs inside the browser, but then it just downloads other stuff, and it's used by a number of different threat actors. So the second stage varies depending on who's using it, but we're seeing a lot of that. Just want to highlight that and just remind people, and we'll talk about this a bit more in a minute, but be careful where you're downloading stuff. Make sure the update notice you're getting is actually a legitimate update notice from the software, and maybe don't just click the link that says you need an update, but actually go back to the source to get the update. Also, the colors between the different pie charts do match up. So Solar Marker was #1 last month, and it was #3 here. So you can kind of see the comparison here and how some of the things moved around, and the pie shifts around. So there's the actual malware being used changes all the time. We could talk about that forever, but we have other topics. So you guys have anything else you want to say about this or questions, and we can move on to the next slide.
I guess it just seems like the info stealers are up on the rise here, huh? It seems like a couple others are more prevalent as well.
Yeah, info stealers are real common. I mean, when we actually see a full breach that makes the news, a lot of times it's because they already have login info. Like the first thing we notice is somebody just logged in. Well, that's usually because previously there might have been an info stealer that had got that information, and an initial access broker has sold it to somebody. A lot of the people that just do some of this drive-by stuff, they're just collecting info, and then they resell it to the people who actually do the more nefarious things like ransomware and that sort of thing. All right. So talking about ransomware, big surprise, ransomware is up. We talk about this a bit in our annual MSP threat report, and we break this out a bit more. But basically last year, 2023, we saw a 94% increase in ransomware activity over the year before. so over 2022. So the amount of ransomware attacks last year doubled from the previous year. Now, that being said, 2022, we actually saw a drop at the first of the year because of the Ukraine conflict. A lot of the Russian hackers who were doing the ransomware attacks were busy doing cyber warfare and got a bit distracted. And there was, anyway, we've talked about that in some previous reports as well. But 2022 saw a dip. 2023, it caught up. So far this year, things have been kind of steady. There hasn't been a major increase or major decrease. If you look at the last 3 months of last year, the first 3 months of this year, it's kind of rounds up. It's still going up a bit, but not a major change, at least in this quarter. And then looking at the technique, so the techniques, these are the ways that threat actors go about doing what they do. So this doesn't get into the actual weeds and like the commands that they're running, but what the objectives of those commands are. So for example, they or how they go about doing things. So process injection, they're actually injecting their process into another process, so it looks like a legitimate process is doing the malicious things in order to get around EDR, and so on and so forth. Big thing here is if you notice the top 10 don't really change. Their positions change, but for the most part, threat actors are really doing the same activities over and over again. There's sometimes they may come up with a new method of going about it. And there are some new vulnerabilities that they may be utilizing, but really comes down to it, looking at the bigger scale, it all is pretty much the same kind of things that they're doing over and over again.
Bryson, on the process injection you just mentioned, how do I prevent that? Is that an EDR that I have to run, or is there something specific?
Yeah, that's something EDR should be good at. When a process tries to inject into another process, that's something a behavioral analysis should identify as malicious. Most of the time, normal applications don't have a reason for doing that. So something that's monitoring process behavior, again, like an EDR, is going to be picking up on that and going to be detecting it and stopping it before it actually gets too far. I will say a lot of the data we see, we're only really looking at that initial access side because we're getting a lot of data from our EDR and it's actually stopping it before it gets too far. So we don't always get to the actual actions and like the impact, the ransom. We're just seeing the droppers and the initial access because in the EDR it's actually stopping it before it gets much further than that. Sometimes we don't catch, we may see the lateral movement because it's the initial infections on a machine that doesn't have EDR. That's actually pretty common. But yeah,
I think Bryson, real quick to what you were just saying, just to key off it. I mean, when we talking about security controls, like if I look at MITRE and I dig into some of these different methods from initial access standpoint, right? When you talk about any machine that doesn't have protections on it and what those look like, right? It's so much about building your control stack when you look at it to make sure that you understand the different methods of access and where it is. And how they can get in, because so many, I know inside the SOC, when we look at a lot of the data of what's there, a lot of the successful attacks that we help partners with are because of, well, we left ports open, or we don't have protections on certain machines, or a visitor walked into an office and they were able to join the internal corporate Wi-Fi, their machine was already infected, right? You got this whole list of things. And so it really comes into the understanding from a security control standpoint of, yes, you need an EDR. I need that there to protect, to be able to identify these things. And obviously, if it's there and if the access comes in and it's active, then in many cases it will see them. But also understanding that from a, defense in depth, right? Making sure that I understand the different steps and stages that an attacker goes through to get access to an environment, and making sure that I'm able to stop at each one of those layers, not just relying on just one tool. I mean, I'm a big proponent of EDR, no conversations there and what those pieces are, but understanding that security is much broader than one tool. There is no one-stop shop for the security conversation. The only one-stop shop is taking the time to understand from a security control standpoint how I need to lock down an environment. I will now get off my soapbox, but it really is so keen, because I have these conversations daily with either our partners or with people who are looking at, well, how do I improve my security? What is it? And everybody's looking for the one or two things that will solve all their problems, and realizing, yes, there's one or two things that can significantly reduce the risk, but you still have to do the foundational stuff right to be protected.
Yeah. So yeah, thanks for that, Drew. That's good points. Moving on, we want to talk a little bit, expand a bit on some stuff that was in the MSP threat report. One of the things that we spent some time talking about was the rise of drive-by compromises, and how that works. We also talked about the different file formats that threat actors are using. So a lot of the changes that we've seen in the actual malware activity over the last few years kind of stems back to a change that Microsoft made in how Office works, and how it macros are enabled or disabled if you download a file. So I think it was 2022 when Microsoft made this change. But before that, most of your malware infections, or a lot of them, came from Emotet with a malicious Excel document with macros embedded. That was like the normal way you would see malware being spread. Microsoft changed it so that macros are just turned off by default. And if you download a file, you can't even, the enable macros button, they took it away. So you actually had to go deep into the file system and make some changes to actually run a spreadsheet with macros, made it more difficult for them to threat actors to actually get stuff to be infected. So they start changing the different ways that they use for getting files, people to open files and actually get infected. And there's been a string of vulnerabilities related to Windows Smart Screen. So Windows Smart Screen is the actual tool in Windows where if you download a file and you just double click and open an exe, it's going to tell you, hey, this was from the internet, it's unsafe. And there's two parts of that. One is there's a metadata about a file that says, hey, this was downloaded from the internet. And then the other part is, if that exists, there's a reputation lookup that identifies malicious software. So the bypass sort of bypasses that whole initial check, so it never checks for the reputation side. And there's been, again, a number of these bypasses. If you go back to last year, there was one of these, just to show you how this kind of worked. You would download for your initial infection a shortcut file, and then that shortcut would have a link to another file which uses a protocol called WebDAV, which basically lets you treat a file on the internet as if it's a file running on your computer. And so just a shortcut via WebDAV to another file, and that bypassed that initial check because it wasn't checking the link inside the link. So that was fixed in CVE 2023-36025, which was last fall. And then the next thing that the threat actors realized is, well, if that initial shortcut isn't to the actual payload, but it's a shortcut to a shortcut, and that's what we're actually seeing here. So you've downloaded a file that claims to be a PDF installer. It's actually just a shortcut, and that shortcut is a shortcut to a shortcut, which then has the installer. Because of those various layers, the check gets bypassed. And so then that was patched in CV 2024-21-351, which was back in February. Well, just this week, there was a new vulnerability patch. The actual details of how that specific one works, it was just patched, and the technical details haven't been released. But according to ZDI, which is the Zero Day Initiative, and Google Tag, it's already been exploited in the wild before the patch came out. So it's a continuing thing. But almost all of these go back to fake installers. A lot of SEO, malware, malvertising, SEO optimization kind of stuff, where they're convincing people to download fake software. So if you just go online, for example, we've seen somebody download a fake Steam installer. So somebody on their work machine wants to install Steam. They Google Steam, which is a platform for playing video games. They click on the first link, and that first link isn't actually the official repo, but it's an ad that leads to a malicious URL, which again is a shortcut to the actual fake installer. All that just kind of pointing out how complex this is, how different layers that things are. But the main point is any software that you want to install, don't click on links from forums. Don't click on the first thing that shows up when you Google. Find out who actually makes the software, go to their website and go through the official channels to download it, or else you're probably going to get malware.
I guess I'm lucky that I'm not a big gamer, so I don't really download those kinds of things. But I might be privy to other
Also
kinds of
seeing,
things.
fake VPN software, OBS, which is a video streaming, day trading software. That's another one. They like to. There's several.
That's true, I think.
Yeah, there's been some people get on forums where people are asking questions about day trading. And they're like, hey, I had this software that helped me, and they then include a link in the forum post.
Are you telling me that the right answer when I want something is not to go say, where can I get it free?
Yes.
Is that not the next right answer?
That is not the right answer. You're probably going to get malware.
So maybe that's a good segue. Also, you mentioned our yearly threat report there for a second. Let's maybe talk about that for a minute here. So we just released our MSP-focused yearly threat report. People can download that already. I believe there's actually a link in the comments, and you see it down here in the banner as well. This is a lot of work that Bryson and team in the CRU, our Cyber Research Unit, are putting in every year, analyzing the data that we have access to from a number of million of endpoints that we have under management, where we're looking at what's collectively going on, what do we see, and we collect all that information and distill it into this report. There is a lot of quite interesting themes in there. Some of it Bryson just mentioned as well, right? Ransomware, surprise, surprise, has been on the rise in 2023. What we've been trying to really focus on with the MSP threat report is really twofold. One of them is, as you keep hearing me say, right, it's the MSP threat report. We're really focusing on the MSP space, and specifically on the MSPs that are working with small businesses, right? It's not the largest MSSPs that are dealing with the top banks in the world or something like that. It's really focused on more on the small business angle of the threat landscape. And I think that's twofold interesting for you as an MSP. It's understanding, well, what is really hitting you? Where do you have to put your efforts in protecting your environment and your customers? And it's also helping you when you're going to your customers and helping them understand, hey, look, here's what's happening. You are not, you are a target of these bad guys, right? It's not like just because you don't think you're important and maybe in the grand scheme of things, you don't have very confidential information about how to build spaceships and things like that an attacker might be interested in, but your infrastructure is still under attack. And the threat report outlines a little bit on why that is and what the bad guys are doing with it. And so we've been trying to make sure that in the report, we're showing you what's happening, but then also how is this relevant to you as an MSP or an SMB as well, right? Anything else you want to highlight, Drew, that comes to mind on the threat report, or Bryson?
Well, no, I think the biggest thing is we're getting ready, I think, to get into a really fun conversation here, which you mentioned earlier about the XZ outbreak and some of that pieces that are there, which really speaks to an area of a couple of topics we talk about in the threat report this year. But the one thing I think I would mention is, and it's in the comments, make sure you register. So we've got a webinar actually coming up on the 25th, specifically about the threat report. So we're going to come back and do a deep dive on everything that's in there. That's not what we're going to do here in this briefing, but I do want to make sure everybody's aware of that. That way you'll get a reminder. That way you'll know it's there, because there's going to be a lot of good content. But go ahead and download the threat report, get familiar with it, and then we're going to unpack it for you in that webinar as we really see it. But with that, Rafi, I know when we were prepping for this briefing, that XZ util interesting storyline, we'll say it that way, that's really interesting, really came up in the conversation. So I don't know whether Bryson, whether you or Rafi want to start that, but I think there's a lot of interesting discussion around threats that's really interesting in that topic.
Yeah, I think Bryson is probably best positioned to give us some of the details. I don't keep up with every single vulnerability and exploit and threat actor out there, right? But I hear enough, and And I jump on the things that a lot of people talk about. And this is definitely one of these attacks that a lot of people have started talking about in the security community. Lots of people started looking into this because, not necessarily because of the technologically super sophisticated way that something was done. There's some interesting things there too, but it's also just because of the method that they use, and also the I guess the long play, right? They didn't just go in and, I don't know, like found a buffer overflow in the code and then exploited that. No, they actually surgically inserted themselves as people into the ecosystem and then started introducing vulnerabilities and very, very interesting. Maybe Bryson, if you can help us a little bit on unpacking what really happened with this what is XC to start with. Give us a little bit of an overview here.
Okay, so yeah, to start off with, XZ is a file format used in Linux and Unix versions primarily. It's a format used for compressing files. So it uses the LZMA compression algorithm, which 7-Zip also uses. If you guys are familiar with 7-Zip and Windows, it has LZMA as one of the options. It's a high lossless compression. Before LZMA, gzip was the standard used in Linux, but LZMA gets a file down to about 70% of what gzip will. So it's a better compression. Used a lot for packaging Windows, or not Windows, the Linux kernel images. If you download a Linux kernel image, it's usually using XZ just because it's a large file and it's a high compression. And it's become very central to a lot of how a lot of Linux and Unixes work, including Mac OS. So it's there like at the very base of the operating system. Now, this story all kind of starts with back in 2015. Now this is what led to the actual backdoor being possible. But in this is a part of an email from the dev mailing list. That's how a lot of these open source projects keep track of things, or through mailing lists. But there was an update that added systemd as a dependency for OpenSSH. So the SSH server used by default on pretty much all the Unixes out there. Systemd is it's a core component of modern Linuxes that controls a lot of things. And in order to deal with some errors that were occurring during the whole build process, they made systemd a dependency for OpenSSH. Well, systemd has LZMA, which is part of the XZ utils, as a dependency. So it's when you actually get into the technical side, again, it gets really complicated. There's several layers deep in how all this all works. But that's what originally started all this. But then when we get to the actual op that happened, so this is most likely a state-sponsored actor. There's still a lot of questions about who this might be. People are looking at time zones on the different commits and that sort of thing. But this person named Jia Tan first appeared out of nowhere. They submitted a patch to the XZ open source project. So an open source project means anybody can contribute to it. However, there are official maintainers who are in charge, who you basically just submit your patch, and then they actually review it and decide whether or not to include it in the code or not. So this is just some random guy, and the initial patch was just for, basically it was a style guide. It was a .editor config file, which when you open up an IDE, which is a tool a programmer uses to look at source code, this just determines things like using spaces instead of tabs, which is a whole thing in the programmer world, whether you should use spaces or tabs for white space and how you line up code. So all the first patch,
just be clear, it's spaces.
Yeah. Just pointing out that it's just a very basic, simple, here, I wrote this to help. It didn't actually contribute any real code or change anything. That was the first thing. And then as time goes on, there's this person, Jia Tan, continues making additional little changes and progress and starts contributing. And then other people start showing up, which a lot of these other people who show up as part of this whole drama also only appear in this mailing list. Like they don't exist anywhere else. So they're probably all part of the same op. But they started putting pressure on the maintainer. So the maintainer wasn't really keeping up to date on the code, wasn't making regular updates. They talked about some health issues and all that. And so people started really pressuring them to have somebody else help out. And then we start seeing in the mailing list, this is Jia Tan becomes more and more involved. Other people are pushing more and more for this person to take over. And eventually this person becomes another maintainer. So the original creator and Jia Tan are now the official maintainers of XZ. And then eventually we get to a patch pushed just in March of this year. Sorry, I think February was when the actual backdoor was included. And then we start seeing emails by different people trying to push like Debian, which is a common Linux distro, and Fedora, and we see people trying to say, hey, there's a new XZ utils, you need to include this in the new version. So again, more of that social engineering, trying to get them to push this new version out until we get
and to pause there for just a second, Bryson, before you do that, because there's a step in between that I find really interesting. So if I go back to, I think it was in July of 23, if I remember right, before Tan became one of the maintainers, but as they were communicating and doing pressure, they actually submitted to remove or disable iFunction, from a vulnerability testing standpoint to what was actually done, so that, so it's like a year play, right? So not only are we looking at a multiple over time of social engineering gaining access, but then we also see a slow movement of decisions that enabled the ultimate play they did this year, right? Because without disabling some of those vulnerability functions, they never could have gotten in 6 months later the changes they were trying to pull in, which to me is just, I mean, from a long play, you deal with people who are trying to do cons and things like that. This is like an interesting multi-year story of a con, right? It's a long play con of what's going on. But back to you. But it's just, to me, the depth of what happened is, I don't want to over celebrate somebody that's a threat actor, but there's some interesting conversations in this one.
Yeah, exactly. This identity and even the social engineering all started October 2021. The actual malicious code wasn't pushed until February of 2024. So it's several years of just actually establishing themselves as reliable maintainers of this code, like actually making real contributions, improving the code, but making some subtle changes. And we'll talk about the actual attack in a second, and how it works. But the last bit, it was March, right at the end of March. Andres Freund, who is somebody who works for Microsoft, was essentially found some latency in an OpenSSH connection and started debugging it, and then found the backdoor and reported it.
This reminds me, is it the cuckoo sec? Clifford Stoll, right? Like the very, very old story on how he found the first virus in a big system, where he looked at like that. Back then you were billed on the time that you used in the mainframe or something like that. And he looked at these timings and they were off. And somehow through that, he found the first virus. Is like, I'm getting the story completely wrong here, but it's this beautiful historic reference here of someone looking at timings and then finding the vulnerability, right? Or the exploit here.
Right. So that's the overall timeline of the actual like social engineering side of thing. And again, people have been looking at trying to analyze like the time zones being used when you actually submit the code, the timestamps will report your time code, your time zone along with it to help keep track of times of things. Time's really important in computers. And most of the commits were made in I think it was GMT +8, which is in China. However, there were some that were actually in more of a Middle Eastern time zone. I think it was like GMT +2 or +3, somewhere around there. So there's the consensus by most people that I'm seeing as they're analyzing this data is that whoever this G10 is, which is probably not a person but probably a group, they were trying to make it look like they were someone from China. A lot of the supposition I'm seeing is suggesting it is SRV, which is the Russian intelligence agency that also did SolarWinds. Just because of the complexity and the way they went about this. Again, it was a long-term, very professional. The operational security was amazing. You don't see what you see a lot of times where someone will like use the same username or email address in multiple places. Like all the email addresses between this G10 person and then some of these others who like this Jigar Kumar, and there's a couple of other names that were used to try to support the whole, hey, we need this other guy to take over sort of narrative. They only exist in these mailing lists. Like they don't show up other places. They have no other persona. They were very, very much seem to be people created just for the social engineering side of this thing. And then
so maybe to kind of round it out, Bryson, the attack itself, I think there was one very interesting piece where and help me out here, but basically it was not the code itself that was backdoored. And especially today with a lot of the security tools, and like we're looking more and more into like GitHub and there's security scanners running through there, finding the backdoors and vulnerable code and credentials and all kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
That would not even have caught this, because what they did is they embedded code in the build files. Like, how did that work?
Right. So what they actually did. So this isn't a vulnerability. This is actually a backdoor. It is a backdoor into OpenSSH, and they compromise the actual build process itself. So as part of building software, so if you take the source code and you want to turn that into something that'll actually run on your computer, there's a build process. Now, just building XZ utils by itself, the way this was done wouldn't actually result in the backdoor. But when a maintainer of a Linux distribution, when they bring that code in and their build process slightly different, then that part was compromised. So it showed up in a couple of the development versions of Fedora as well as Debian, but not in a lot of other places. So, but it was an OpenSSH vulnerability or backdoor. It actually plugged into the OpenSSH connection so that when you can log into OpenSSH with a key instead of a password. It's a file you have on your computer that follows certain cryptographic rules, but it's a specific private key that you could use that would basically, if you use that key, it would give you access to any OpenSSH instance that was running that had this backdoor installed.
Well, and I think the interesting thing about this is how close it came, right? So, I mean, frankly, you said it a little bit earlier, but when the guy from Microsoft found it, he stumbled on it, right?
Yeah.
Like we're saying, but they were also, if you look at a lot of the communication, those same maintainers and everybody else were pushing to get it into other distributions of Linux through the process. So we were on the verge of, say, Ubuntu, on other ones that were being propositioned to get this versioning changed to the compromised version. So not only did we just catch it on the ones that are there, but it was on, I mean, it would have been basically across pretty much the entire Linux landscape in short order had it not been stumbled on, which would have been I mean, this is about as close as you can come to, something as large as we've probably seen in a while on that kind of landscape.
Yeah, if it wasn't caught so early, it could have been bad. But at the moment, it looks like it's been pretty much restricted to, like I said, dev versions of Linux. So the impact has been not huge. Like, we're not seeing it compromised all over the place.
Yeah. So I guess, gosh, so many takeaways from this, right? Like, there could be a narrative of don't always update your software right away, which I don't want to go down, right? Like that, I don't subscribe to that philosophy at all. I think you should always update as quickly as possible. And who knows, what else has been backdoored with something similar, right? If we found this one, there might be another one where they didn't get exposed yet, and that exists, right? So definitely a fascinating type of attack. There's way more information on the internet if anyone is interested on some more of the details. And in fact, there's some researchers that I know have been going around, and they've been looking at OpenSSH or SSH servers and started seeing where they can log in, right, with that private key that's now publicly available. And they found some other OpenSSH interesting problems where a number of implementations, they let you do a one-shot login, and you can even take over existing sessions very, very easily. So I think there's going to be a bunch of patches coming for SSH in general. Anyways, any final words on XC before we close up here? I think we're a little bit over time.
I mean, we could go more into the actual build process and that sort of thing, but I don't know if we want to go that far into the weeds or not.
No, I mean, the only thing I would say is, related to the threat report and things like that. I mean, again, this ties very well into some of the items we bring out in the threat report. So again, I would just encourage you, jump on that webinar. It's going to be an interesting discussion when we get into it, when we start digging down. And, it's interesting when you can take some of the things you've seen historically and you start telling a story around it. And then something like this happens that just reaffirms, in some cases, assumptions, decisions, things you're seeing on activity. And then it's like, oh yeah, this just reaffirms everything that's there. So I would, make sure that you're registering for that so you can see it. But
yeah, April 25. Yeah. Again, the link is in the comments section here on the live stream. I think with that, Bryson, thank you so much for preparing all the data as usual and walking us through the XC backdoor details here. It's fascinating to see that whole development. I'm still like, whenever these new twists come out, right? It's not this technically super complicated thing, but it's like this, whenever there's these new things where the threat actors just think slightly different and hear the long game, it's just fascinating. Drew, thanks for your commentary. It's always fun to get some insights from you, like seeing what we actually see in the SOC holistically on the different attacks. With that, again, April 25, please sign up, join us to talk a little bit about the threat report, what we've seen over 2023, the relevant things for MSPs and their small business customers. Thank you, everybody, for dialing in and joining us today. Thanks for the comments that people submitted, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Have a great day.